Okay, this one's going to be a bit of a different one today because I think I'm doing something that I've never actually done before, and that's discuss a video by another YouTuber. And in this case, the YouTuber in question is called Upper Echelon Gamers, and the video is called Gaming Unions Are Not the Answer. And in it, he attempts to offer arguments as to why unions don't offer a solution to some of the abuses that are occurring on a regular basis within the gaming industry. I say attempts because I think there are some glaring flaws in his arguments, but we'll get to that. The video starts by saying that this is a subject that should be discussed.
Okay, today I'm going to ruffle some feathers and at bare minimum stir up a significant amount of controversy in the comment section, I believe, but that's okay. That's good, in fact, because talking about these concepts is necessary rather than simply conforming to a perceived narrative that aligns with my most active viewer base purely out of a desire to mitigate any sort of backlash.
Absolutely. I totally agree that this is an issue that should be discussed, and I welcome the fact that Upper Echelon Gamers is talking about it. But why begin by talking about ruffling feathers or being controversial? If it's important to talk about these issues, wouldn't it be better to adopt a more conciliatory tone and try and invite people to come in and talk about it on a kind of level playing field? This doesn't sit well with me when you start off a video in this way. And I know a lot of YouTubers are guilty of it, and I'm probably guilty of it myself, of saying, oh, this is going to be controversial. But you're kind of inviting people in to get angry and shouty, and it's probably not helping matters at all to do it that way. And he also doesn't help matters when he goes on to say,
unions are not the answer for the video game industry. They just aren't.
Unions aren't the answer for the video game industry. They just aren't. To state this so categorically without offering any arguments as to why immediately sets alarm bells ringing for me, I'm sorry. This is assertion. It's not argument. And then he goes on to call people who think unions might be the answer delusional.
In certain companies, there is a need for some sort of positive shift and worker protections. And one of those steps might be unions. It really may be true, but probably not, because unions are not this one-size-fits-all, perfectly balanced solution to worker protection like so many people blindly, delusionally, idiotically seem to believe.
Delusional. So now we know why he begins by talking about ruffling feathers. It appears that he's actually just trying to head off anyone who would disagree with him. You know, poisoning the well, as it were. So far, there's been no sign of anything remotely approaching an argument. There's been assertion, unions are not the solution, they just aren't, and insults. If you disagree, you're delusional. So much for being a subject that should be discussed. If you're really serious about discussion, you don't try to invalidate dissenting opinions before they're even aired by discrediting or undermining those who might air them. It's an incredibly disingenuous form of discourse, and as I said before, it's a form of poisoning the well. It's not really surprising, though, given that the level of actual argument on offer isn't particularly high. First off, there's all the stuff about unions funding political parties, and he goes on at some length about how much money unions put into the Democrat Party in the US. And, you know, I've heard this argument before in the UK. The unions put all their money into the Labour Party. Well, yeah, because political parties have to be funded. So I will turn this around and say, so who funds the Republicans? And who funds the Tories in the UK? Well, you'll find it's wealthy individuals and business organisations. How's that any different to unions? Of course, organisations are going to try and fund political parties that support them or have similar ideas. And in the UK, the Labour Party was in part at least set up by the unions to try and further their agenda, which in this case was to give rights to their workers, their members. It's not really in and of itself an argument against unions, but I kind of think I can see where he's going at this point. He goes on to say that those on the left don't get to have it both ways. And I think the point here is that you can't support unions for the gaming industry and then complain about unions that represent other industries. In this case, police unions in the States. On the surface, that almost seems to be a cogent point. But there are two problems. First, lumping all Democrats together with activists on the left is, again, a little bit disingenuous. There's a very broad selection of people with very different political ideals making up the left side of the dividing line, if you like, in politics. And, this isn't a monolith that lumbers along with everybody believing the same thing. And I certainly wouldn't necessarily lump Democrats together with far left activists. I wouldn't say that at all. Certainly that's not often the case in the UK. There is a crossover, but they're not the same people by and large. And if you're trying to do that, you're doing pretty much the same as those people who call anyone on the right side of the political line fascists. Of course they're not. And I think we need to be much more careful about how we label people if we're going to have an honest debate. The second point relates to the first in that he seems to be suggesting that because unions protect bad apples, they're a bad idea, period. The example he gives is, as I said before, the police unions and the controversies surrounding them in the States currently.
Police unions are under fire for protecting bad apples, for enabling bad behavior and mitigating the risk of employee sanctions, for ensuring that bad cops keep their job, are paid well, and can work elsewhere. But all of this, and I mean literally all of it, is a fundamental premise of what a union does. Activists are currently reckoning with the bad side of union operations, even if they can't see it for themselves. The protection of workers you don't believe should be protected. They are against that, but without mincing words, that's the actual point of a union to begin with.
That's the actual point of a union to begin with. Absolutely. This is what unions do. And he is suggesting here that that's a bad thing, that a union representing their members is somehow bad. And look, this is no different from someone who's been accused of a crime getting legal counsel. In fact, unions often provide just that. Is that really a bad thing? Would any sensible person really argue that people should not have legal representation? If anyone does argue against police having representation, then I would suggest they haven't thought it through. And, I would agree with Upper Echelon Gamers in this sense, that he's saying that people who want to abolish the police haven't thought it through. And the conclusion shouldn't be that unions are inherently bad because sometimes they protect bad apples. The fact is that most of the time they protect their ordinary members, and sometimes those ordinary members are bad apples. What Upper Echelon Gamers is actually saying here is that we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you think about it for just a few seconds, this isn't actually an argument against unions at all. It would be like saying we should abolish the police because some police officers abuse their position, an argument which, I've already mentioned, Upper Echelon Gamers says shouldn't even be given the time of day.
For the sake of this video, I will discuss reform, not the brain-dead, intellectually untenable idea of police abolition, which is not even worth acknowledging as a sane ideological stance. Don't even give them the credit of engagement on that one.
As Upper Echelon Gamers himself says, you can't have it both ways. And I couldn't agree more. If you think, as we both do in this instance, that abolishing the police because of a few bad apples is a bad idea, then why would you argue against unions for defending them? As I said before, this isn't an argument against unions at all. Upper Echelon Gamers himself says that their purpose is to protect their members, and that is exactly what they're doing. You can't pick and choose. And hopefully, if people in the gaming industry decided to unionize, that's exactly what the union would do for them. I mean, I remember years ago when I was working for a particular company and we had a boss who was a complete bully, and we actually ended up unionizing in order to get him off our backs somewhat. Now, it wasn't a perfect solution and things didn't improve completely overnight, but joining the union did help. And I know this is only an anecdote from one person, but we do know that unions have had a history of helping people who have been bullied in their workplaces. So it would seem the evidence would say that unionizing does help in some circumstances. And look, it's not a panacea. It's not, as Upper Echelon Gamers himself says, a one-size-fits-all. But unionizing can and does help. But Upper Echelon Gamers isn't done. He has already talked about left-leaning activists as if they're the only people who advocate for unions. But he then goes on and he says that there's an organisation called Game Workers Unite. And he starts with some quotes from their page in which they lay out their position. Basically, they're a group which are obviously on the left of the political spectrum, and some of their positions could be described as contentious, to say the least, such as their refusal to engage with police unions. But what is their significance in this discussion? Well, Upper Echelon Gamers says that the organisation is not a traditional union, but an evolution of the concept.
This is not a traditional union that focuses on worker rights. This is an evolution on that concept.
But is Game Workers Unite an evolution of the union concept? Really, is it? After banging on about the organisation's policies and positions for roughly 3.5 minutes, Upper Echelon Gamers finally says this.
This isn't a union.
It's not a union. Which begs the question, why on earth have you been banging on about them for the past 3.5 minutes then? It isn't a union. You said it yourself. It isn't a union.
This isn't a union, but it claims to be one while pushing for a unionized game industry.
It's a group that seems to be posing as a union or trying to get close to unions in order to further its own political agenda. And the fact is that this kind of thing happens all the time. But it's not a union. So again, this isn't an argument against unions or unionisation of the workforce. At most, it could be seen as a warning to make sure we properly regulate unions so that they remain within their core remit to protect their members. In this video, Upper Echelon Gamers talks about political funding by unions, he talks about unions protecting their members, and he talks about an organisation that isn't a union. It's an interesting video, and I do agree with him that it's a subject that needs to be discussed. But what it isn't is a coherent or well thought out argument against unionisation, or more importantly, against unionisation in the gaming industry. Sorry, but it just isn't. And anyone who thinks it is delusional. I'm just kidding. Look, as ever, you guys might disagree with me, and if you do, you know the drill. Let me know in the comments and we can get into it there. Because as Upper Echelon Gamers says, I do think it's an important subject, and I do think we should be discussing it. And you could agree with me, you could disagree with me, you might agree with Upper Echelon Gamers, and that's fine, because we should be debating this. And in the meantime, give us a thumbs up, all the rest of it, like, subscribe, share with your friends, all the other nonsense. And I'm off to get myself a cup of tea. I'll speak to you in the next one. Bye.